Good afternoon and welcome to Mountain States Legal Foundation's webcast. We began producing these webcasts to speak directly with our friends and supporters and have loved the opportunity to dive deeply into a single case and explore the ins and outs with all of you who make that work possible. If you received the webcast invitation from a friend and are unfamiliar with our organization, Mountain States Legal Foundation is a nonprofit, public interest legal foundation established in 1977. We're located just outside Denver, Colorado. MSLF defends clients in litigation in defense of individual liberties protected by our Constitution. At MSLF, we believe freedom is worth fighting for. Some of those freedoms include the right to own and use property, limited government, and the free enterprise system. My name is Cristen Wohlgemuth. I serve as the president of MSLF, and I have the privilege of serving as your moderator today. Our panel is MSLF attorney Cody Wisniewski, who leads our litigation efforts in this arena. We're also joined by Zachary Fort. He is the president of New Mexico Shooting Sports and one of our clients in this case. Today's topic is the suit MSLF initiated this month on behalf of a number of New Mexicans against their governor, who doubled down on her quarantine orders that, among other things, closed businesses relate to firearms. Cody will get into the specifics of her order in just a minute. You've seen the news reports indicating that our understanding American population is beginning to get less understanding as the lockdowns stretch out indefinitely, and government action continues to overstep its constitutional limitations. In the past week, demonstrations have broken out in Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Idaho, Kentucky, Michigan, Minnesota, North Carolina, Utah, Virginia, and Washington. In Pennsylvania, the state legislature got into the act, sending Governor Wolf a bill that would order much of the state reopened more quickly than he would like. More protests are planned for this week. Feeding the frustrations driving these protests and this case is not just the lockdowns, but the unthinking overreach we see in how they are imposed. In California, sheriff's deputies arrested a paddleboarder alone in the ocean off of Malibu. Just down the coast, the city of San Clemente filled a skating board park with 37 tons of sand, and various states restrict big box retailers from selling non-essential items, which means that you pick up a new deadbolt for your front door at Home Depot, but probably not the bag of mulch 2 aisles over. In New Mexico, non-essential items include firearms. As I turn to our panel, please note a couple of features on your computer or your smartphone. The chat function allows you to begin asking questions of our staff and panel, and we hope you do so. You can also hit the raise your hand button to ask a live question over the phone or internet. So Cody, why don't we start this discussion with some introductions? Tell us a little bit about why working in Second Amendment law caught your attention and where it has taken you.
Of course. Thank you, Kristen. I have really enjoyed working in Second Amendment law, and I really got an introduction to it a little bit later than I expected. So growing up in Southern California, where gun control was at its height, I kind of quickly saw how government overreach was expanding, especially in the arena of firearms. And I noticed that it seemed to be a preeminent fighting ground, yet there didn't seem to be a ton of organizations fighting back. So when I had the opportunity to join Mountain States a few years back and take over a practice that was waiting for some revitalization, I was very excited to do so and happy to jump on and keep the fight up, not only where some organizations are doing it in the legislatures, but to bring the fight in the court through a concerted effort with consistent arguments and a consistent approach.
Zach, if I can switch to you for just a minute, you volunteered to join this suit against your governor. What prompted your interest and your action?
Hey, so thanks first and foremost to Mountain States Legal Foundation for being a partner with New Mexicans in this fight against our governor and our overreaching government. So a little bit of background on me. My name is Zachary Fort. I'm the president of New Mexico Shooting Sports Association. Founded in 1935, New Mexico Shooting Sports Association promotes the shooting sports in New Mexico. But in recent years, when I've gotten involved, we've really taken on a role in fighting for our right to keep and bear arms, not only under the Second Amendment of the Constitution, but under Section 2, Article 6 of the New Mexico State Constitution, because New Mexicans have a guaranteed right under their state constitution as well as that federal constitution to keep and bear arms. So, I mean, when the governor came out with these orders and taking action against these orders really seemed that it was the really only course that we had when these type of egregious government overreaching actions take place. A little bit more about me. I'm a volunteer. As president of New Mexico Shooting Sports Association, this is purely a volunteer board position with a nonprofit based in New Mexico. Outside of that, I do long-term financial planning for P&M Resources, an electric utility with operations in New Mexico and Texas.
Very good. Cody, why don't we jump into the case? Can you break the case down just a bit for our audience? First, tell us who we're fighting and what they're arguing.
Absolutely. So the case is Aragon versus the Governor Grisham, and it specifically challenges the governor's order, as well as the Department of Public Health's guidelines that close non-essential businesses and fail to designate firearms retailers, ranges, and repair facilities as essential, thereby forcing their closure. So we filed the lawsuit on April 10th, and shortly thereafter filed a motion for a temporary restraining order or preliminary injunction. And what that would do would be to halt enforcement of the order and the policies while the case is pending. So the court denied the temporary restraining order, which isn't uncommon. Those aren't always successful. But we are currently in the process of briefing the preliminary injunction. And what that would do, as I said, would be to stop New Mexico from enforcing its order while we litigate the case, which would allow firearm retailers, ranges, repair facilities, and other incidental firearms businesses to remain open during this time, while of course abiding by any of the other state orders on social distancing or workforce reductions. But it would at least allow them to remain open and for people to exercise their natural, fundamental right to keep and bear arms by both purchasing arms during this time to defend themselves and their families, as well as to maintain proficiency with those arms and to be able to go to ranges and to have arms repaired if they need it as well.
Very good. So I'm sure most of the folks on this call understand why a plumber, for example, is an essential service at this moment, or even an electrician. Why are firearms retailers essential?
Beyond just the fact that they are dealing in constitutionally protected property, which is of course very important, really the system that the federal government as well as the state of New Mexico have created is what makes firearm retailers essential, especially at this time. So most people are aware, some are not, that just about every firearm transaction has to occur via an in-person transfer with a licensed firearms retailer who's licensed by the federal government. And you can't just order a gun online and have it shipped to your door and open up the box and have a new firearm. That's not how it works anymore. So that the federal government covers most transfers. Well, last year, the state of New Mexico also passed an enhanced background check law, which went further than the federal government's restrictions and requires even more transfers, even private transfers, to be conducted by a licensed firearm retailer licensee. So the system that's been created by the federal government in the state of New Mexico requires people to appear in person in order to purchase and gain possession of a firearm. So there is no other avenue available to people at this time. And by shutting down all firearm retailers, FFLs, federal firearms licensees, and preventing people from going to them and using those facilities, what New Mexico has done is completely preempted and prevented people from exercising their right to go and purchase an arm to use for self-defense. And in a time like this, when many people are, truly kind of concerned about their own safety and the safety of their family and their loved ones.
Very good. Zach, you told us a little of your story earlier, but I'd like to get back to it if you don't mind. New Mexico Shooting Sports Association exists to advocate for gun rights in for New Mexicans. Why was this mission so important to you, and why did you get involved?
So, I mean, at a very fundamental level, your rights should not be diminished because you live in New Mexico versus living in another state like Texas or Colorado even, which is deemed gun stores essential. So first and foremost, there's that fundamental issue. But then let's kind of, dig a little deeper into, the demographics of New Mexico and what living in New Mexico is like. So New Mexico is a very large, mostly rural state. Most of the population lives in what we would call a rural area. Kind of the exception to that is the greater Albuquerque area. But with that being said, the greater Albuquerque area, while it is not a rural area, it's actually a nation leader in a lot of crime categories, which is unfortunate, but it makes it a dangerous place to live at times. And I can't, go too far into different stories because I don't want to give away people's names, but I do know people in Albuquerque who have had to use a firearm to defend themselves. And that's just, it's a very sad reality that this takes place, but in fact, it is a reality. Self-defense is a very real reality for New Mexicans, and not just people in Albuquerque. There are, we see self-defense, use of force in self-defense in other parts of the state as well. So when going through all this, we first and foremost, we have this is about our fundamental constitutional rights. But even when stepping beyond merely a fundamental constitutional right, like the Second Amendment, this is about our right to self-defense. And in particular, we have had officers in the Albuquerque police force who have been tested positive and are not able to work. And then other officers that they have exposed, those officers have to quarantine. So, you have what was already not a fully staffed police force in Albuquerque is already being diminished by this exposure to this disease. So that puts people at even greater risk than they were before. And then to kind of, add into that, New Mexico's criminal justice system already has issues trying to keep people behind bars after they commit crimes and are found guilty of doing so. But, our governor is talking about, has released some inmates. And that's another thing that's pressing on people's minds is that our criminal justice system, which was in a very poor place before all this took place, could be simply overwhelmed. And our right to self-defense would be severely compromised if New Mexicans are not able to purchase firearms during this time.
You bet. I realize we're a little bit early for Q&A, but we have a particularly relevant one given the current conversation that I want to slide in here. Cody, can you speak to the other organizational plaintiffs such as FPC and SAF?
Yeah, absolutely. This case has really been a team effort of, the preeminent Second Amendment advocacy organizations and the organizations that have been fighting this fight for ages, some newer than others, but have been taking a really good charge. So we teamed up with the National Rifle Association, NRA, the Firearms Policy Coalition, and Second Amendment Foundation, and we're all litigating this case and working this case together. So they're all involved in this litigation. We're all of the same mind here, which is a really nice and important development in this arena. And we all recognize the importance of not allowing government overreach to expand at a time like this. The NRA, FPC, SAF, we all have the same goal. And our goal at the end of the day is to protect Americans' natural right to self-defense, your natural right to keep and bear arms. That right is protected by the Second Amendment, is protected by the Constitution, but the government does not have the authority to just unilaterally infringe upon that right and to try to eradicate it, even during a time like this, and especially during a time when Americans are overwhelmingly indicating that their right to self-defense is important. So working with the NRA, working with FPC, and working with SAF has been great. And we're excited to be in with all of them on this case. And we're sure that it will allow us to greatly increase the efficacy of our advocacy in this one.
Very good. John, thank you for that question. And Cody, you've given me a great segue into, let's look at this from the other perspective. State governments do have a legitimate interest in protecting public safety. So why does their interest in stopping the spread of COVID-19 not apply to this situation?
And a lot of that is because of the system I was explaining earlier. The federal government system and the state system has made these retailers essential. It's not just by their virtue of being necessarily. If you had the ability to access arms through some other means, then maybe it would be a different argument, but you don't here. And the key is the state of New Mexico could have reasonably enforced the same regulations against firearm retailers and ranges as it did against grocery stores, and could have said you're allowed to remain open, except you must be abiding by social distancing guidelines and you must be abiding by workforce reduction. A number of other states, and including, as Zach mentioned, Colorado, has specified that those retailers and ranges and whatnot are essential businesses and has imposed the same regulations on them. So these retailers, these ranges, they should be able to operate in that way. Further, they could allow for certain retailers, if they have the capability, to do online sales and just do an in-person pickup to reduce the amount of in-person face-to-face time that there is. The federal government has issued a number of different guidelines addressing federal firearms licensees and allowing for different means of transferring firearms that might not ordinarily be allowed for under normal circumstances, but they're currently allowing for, such as I think a lot of people have seen the drive-through system or parking lot delivery, those sorts of things. The federal government has been very active in allowing and issuing guidance to allow firearm retailers to operate while minimizing their in-person contact. And the fact is here, New Mexico's just essentially ignored all of those and has ignored New Mexicans' natural right to self-defense and has made it impossible for New Mexicans to go and buy arms and to be able to protect themselves at such an important time.
There we go. Zach, can you offer any thoughts on why New Mexico hasn't followed the federal guidance on this issue and the actions of other states even, and that have chosen to leave gun stores open?
Well, I think fundamentally what it comes down to is the person occupying the governor's mansion, Michelle Lujan Grisham. Since her time in Congress, she served in Congress for, I believe, 6 years before becoming governor of New Mexico, where she's been governor for about 2 years now. She has been a very pro-gun control politician, and that's followed her through her entire career. And we can kind of go, if people are interested, we can dive deeper into the demographics of New Mexico, how a largely rural state still has a governor who is pro-gun control. And I think it really goes into what's happening to the Democratic Party, where the rural Democrats are typically kind of pushed out by the urban Democrats in the Albuquerque, Santa Fe areas who make the decisions, but then rural Democrats will then still vote for those urban Democrats statewide. But this really comes down to her. This was her. She is known as a micromanager, and I believe that she and her Department of Health did not want to include gun stores as essential businesses, as it falls in line with her statements and her recent legislative push for gun control. In fact, New Mexico, as Cody mentioned, we passed a criminalization of private firearm sales in the 2019 legislative session, which was her first legislative session as governor. And this past legislative session, a version of a red flag gun confiscation order barely got through, but it did get through, unfortunately. So it really falls in line with a pattern that we're seeing from her as being a very heavily what I like to say, kind of anti-gun governor.
So it sounds like this is from your perspective, a case of leave no crisis, or take advantage of every crisis.
Yes, I mean that's it's what they are, because when they were pushing for the red flag bill, some of the things they were saying and doing kind of stories they were trying to bring up that actually had zero correlation and would not be impacted. It's kind of like don't let a crisis go to waste, as I think was Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, so I'm familiar with that saying. but yeah, it's kind of this, if she can push these gun stores, push these gun stores to close and not operate and not sell guns, unfortunately, that does seem to kind of fit in line with some of her policy agenda that she's been pushing as governor.
And we've seen a lot of that throughout the country. The don't let a good crisis go to waste impacts around the country. But if I can bring it back to home for you, Zach, what is it about? Why is it that the people of Albuquerque have a particular need to protect themselves at this point? Is there an overarching local consideration that we can point to?
I mean, I think the consideration is just how dangerous of a city Albuquerque can be. And actually, when we're talking about how dangerous Albuquerque is, the gun control that they have passed has done absolutely nothing to stop how dangerous Albuquerque has become. In fact, violent crime has gone up, not down, since they passed gun control, because they focus on law-abiding gun owners and not on the criminal element. And actually, I want to tie this back a little bit to rural areas as well. NMSSA has a member who lives in a rural area. She's a woman who lives alone. And she, talking to her about this story where someone broke into her house in the middle of the night when she was there all by herself. And she goes out to the kitchen and there's a man standing there who she's never seen before in her house at 2 a.m. She was armed and she did not shoot the individual. She held him until police arrived, but it took about 45 minutes for police to arrive to that situation because she lived in a very rural area. So particularly for rural areas, you really are on your own when it comes to self-defense, because it can be half an hour to an hour for police to arrive depending on the area. And then in addition to that, firearms are it's a tool of people's work, particularly if you're a rancher and you have to protect your livestock from coyotes. A firearm is a tool that you use for your job. So, and ranchers are an essential business. I mean, if you want to eat beef, you're going to have to, ranchers are essential, and that's a tool of their job is working with a firearm, and they have to be able to acquire firearms and ammunition to protect their herds from coyotes. Particularly in New Mexico, we have a very bad problem with coyotes and ranchers. Ranchers have a serious problem with coyotes in this state. So there's so many different facets to this, but in Albuquerque in particular, I actually know someone who had an attempted break-in at their house. I believe it was last weekend out in the greater Albuquerque area, and they were home in the middle of the day. And we're seeing stories now of businesses that are getting ransacked by criminals because they know that people may or are not in these businesses. But if someone is in their business and they're doing stuff, trying to fulfill online sales, and a group of criminals come in, they're going to need to be able to defend themselves. So.
You offered an interesting comment just before the show started when we were getting ready that New Mexico has and I'm going to get this wrong, so help me out, the highest incidence of auto property theft. Crimes. Is that right?
I think overall for property crime, we're number one. We're definitely in categories. I don't know about burglary if we're number one, but in terms of auto theft and people breaking into cars, we're definitely number one. I don't think anyone even comes close to our auto theft rates here in Albuquerque. I mean, I actually know someone who had a car stolen 3 times, the same vehicle. Which it sounds funny to say, but I don't think people living in Albuquerque would find that statistic to be surprising. So
that's amazing. We have another question, and we're just about ready to go into our Q&A section of our webinar today. So y'all feel free, those of you in the audience, to ask questions through either the chat function or the Q&A box. We have a question from John. Does the New Mexico Emergency Powers Law have any clause that allows gun stores to be closed during times of declared emergencies? Cody, I think this one's yours.
Yeah, so there is language in the New Mexico Emergency Powers Act that purportedly grants the governor the power to do some of the things that she's doing, to close some businesses and whatnot. That act, however, is conditioned on the governor respecting the civil liberties of New Mexicans. By closing firearm retailers and ranges, the governor is not doing that. New Mexicans have the right to keep and bear arms. They have the natural right to self-defense. These are all civil liberties. as that's necessary as part of our system of ordered liberty. And by closing firearm retailers, there is an issue under the act. Most importantly, however, I mean, this is a clear and blatant violation of the Second Amendment and the statute and the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Second Amendment. It's prohibiting individuals from purchasing arms that they would use in the home for self-defense, including handguns. I mean, even if you go under the barest reading of Supreme Court precedent, this clearly falls under it. And the governor's spokeswoman, who speaks on behalf of her, has acknowledged that New Mexicans have the constitutionally protected right to buy arms. It was in one of her statements in response to us filing the lawsuit. And as a result, they had commented something to the effect of, but you don't have the right to then get your neighbors sick or something like that. But in reality, as you know, to reiterate earlier, if those gun stores were abiding by, and they will, social distancing guidelines and workforce reductions, then it would be operating the same as any other essential business. So yes, the statute should not necessarily apply and shouldn't apply here to closing firearm retailers, but beyond that, this is truly a very pure Second Amendment issue.
Okay. That gives me an opportunity to ask one question myself, and this will be the last one from me today. Can you tell us, Cody, exactly what the suit charges and what we and our clients hope to gain from it? What's our hoped for outcome?
Absolutely. The charge of the suit is that the governor's order and the public health order that fails to designate firearms retailers, ranges, and repair facilities and other manufacturers and whatnot as essential businesses violates New Mexicans' Second Amendment protected rights. And our goal through the lawsuit is to stop enforcement of that order in as far as those do violate New Mexicans' Second Amendment protected rights. So in other words, our goal is to get firearm retailers and ranges back open during this time, even abiding by the guidelines that the governor sets, in order to allow New Mexicans to purchase arms, to train with their firearms, to buy ammunition, to buy magazines, things that they need to protect themselves and things that they're constitutionally protected conduct that they're more than allowed to do in this country. I'll also note something that we haven't touched on yet, and Zach can touch on this a little bit more, but by closing firearm ranges, New Mexico also has a live fire component to their concealed carry law. And as a result, people at this time can't truly apply for and get concealed carry permits, and they can't renew concealed carry permits, which is an issue that Zach is experiencing because ranges are closed and they can't go to the range to complete New Mexico State's live shooting requirement. And some other nuances in New Mexico law, if a place sells liquor but doesn't distribute it, so think grocery store, convenience store, gas station, while New Mexico ordinarily allows for open carry, it doesn't allow for open carry in those places, which means while grocery shopping, the only way that you can carry a firearm is if you have a valid concealed carry permit. And by stopping people from getting those and by stopping people from renewing those, New Mexico is also preventing people from defending themselves outside the home. And we all know that the Second Amendment protects your right to carry outside the home as well. While I mean, the Supreme Court hasn't fully explored the bounds of that, we know that that's the case. So you're not allowed to carry a firearm in a grocery store if you don't have a concealed carry permit at this point, and you can't get one. So that's even more concerning. And just another thing that this order fails to include and fails to consider.
So that ties in well with a question that Martha is asking. I would like to buy a handgun as soon as possible. Can I still buy a gun online during the stay-at-home order and have it picked up at a local gun store in my area?
According to the governor's order, and the state police have been going down and shutting down some retailers, they cannot do an in-person transfer unless you are law enforcement. So the orders have a carve out for law enforcement that allows them to still purchase arms and to still use ranges, but it doesn't have that same carve out for citizens, for individuals, for Americans. So under the governor's order, the firearm retailers are not able to conduct the in-person transfer that's necessary for you to purchase a firearm and possess and gain possession of a firearm.
Okay. Next is a question from David. How is the governor's order not discrimination, but bought a gun and had a local FFL do the transfer because all others were closed and he was not? I believe he's referencing discrimination between stores, perhaps.
Yeah, and that would just, the issue there would be something akin to maybe selective prosecution, where police are closing down certain stores and not others. That would definitely be on a case-by-case basis. It would also depend on whether that store had been closed down and then had reopened despite receiving a warning or a citation or something to that effect. So there's not just a general discrimination claim here, but it's just a clear Second Amendment violation in truth.
Okay. A question from Anthony. Yesterday, Attorney General Barr said he would send the Department of Justice out to help any state where rights are being blocked. Do you think this would meet his agenda?
I didn't see Barr's statements, but this is clearly a scenario in which New Mexicans' constitutionally protected rights are being violated by their state government. So it certainly fits within that wheelhouse. But we have a very good team with us. We're litigating with NRA, FPC, and SAF, as I've mentioned. So I'm confident that we can put the arguments before the court that need to be put before the court. We'll see what the AG's office decides to do, whether or not and how they may potentially get involved. But we definitely have a really good team of attorneys and a lot of guys that are focused and specific seasoned Second Amendment litigators. So we've got what we need to move forward, and now we just need to get the briefs done and get the arguments before the court and see what the court has to say.
Very good. Andrew is our next question. Does this infringement on firearms also include police security persons and government officials? One of the things that we've seen a lot is a do as I say, not as I do attitude with the director of one of the directors out of HHS out in California taking his family to the beach soon after he imposed the order, and I believe de Blasio was caught going to his gym. So does this limit our everyone, or is it discriminatory as well?
I was curious if hosting this Zoom webinar would qualify me to get a haircut, I guess, which some politicians have done, but I don't think it has. The answer is that law enforcement and essential services are exempted. So firearm retailers and ranges can still sell firearms to law enforcement officers, to first responders. They can still use ranges to train and maintain proficiency, but individuals cannot. So yes, I mean, this allows police officers to continue to buy guns, to continue to buy ammunition, to continue to buy magazines, to continue to go to shooting ranges, but doesn't allow New Mexicans the same thing. So yeah, there is an issue there that individual citizens are being treated very differently than law enforcement here. And at a time, like Zach said, I mean, when you're in rural New Mexico, just a law enforcement officer having a gun 45 minutes away isn't going to help you. Or when you live in an area where carjackings are really high or burglaries are really high, having a law enforcement officer that was able to train at a range last week doesn't aid you in your own protection. As Americans, we have, and as all people, we have the natural right to self-defense. You have the right to defend yourself, your family, your property. And you shouldn't be treated differently in that defense than any other person. You have the right to do that. So exempting law enforcement officers, while it seems like a push to, allow for more public safety or essential services, well, all it really does is hamstring citizens.
Mhm. In response to your remarks, Eric volunteers at Calibers, which I believe is one of the largest gun stores there in New Mexico. Calibers was shut down, and the police use his range. So, are there alternatives, or how is this impacting public safety?
A number of different citations have gone out to different retailers that stayed open. Those citations specify that according to the governor, they believe that they're allowed to close them and that they have closed them, and that by continuing to operate, they're in violation of the law. They threaten fines and jail time for a second violation, and as high as a $5,000 fine for each violation thereafter. The governor's threatened to revoke business licenses. So these are all extreme remedies. And when you're talking about something like Calibers, it's a larger business. They are, I believe, the largest in New Mexico. They have a couple of different storefronts and a couple of different ranges. But when you're talking about a small mom and pop shop, so one of our clients in this matter is Rose's Guns and More, and they serve a very small community. They're a very small store. They can't afford to receive one citation, let alone 2 or 3. They can't afford to lose their business license. That would be a death nail. So it's really important also to focus on the small businesses that are being hurt here and the individuals that are being hurt. One of our other plaintiffs is a firearms instructor. In fact, Zach had a class scheduled to renew his concealed carry permit with this particular instructor, who's been forced to stop offering all of the in-person classes and the in-person shooting range requirement that New Mexico has. So there's a lot of individuals being harmed, and there's a lot of really small businesses, which we've seen across America as a result of these, but is particularly notable in the firearms context here. Somewhere like Calibers, my understanding of the order and my interpretation of it is that they would be able to remain open for law enforcement use. So they would not be allowed to let any civilians use the range, any civilians enter the store. But if law enforcement wanted to purchase a firearm, to purchase ammunition, or to use the range, that activity would be exempted under the order. I have not heard of the governor changing a position on that, or if there's a different interpretation, but that's my understanding of the order.
Okay. Zach, if I can throw it back to you for just a minute. How has the shutdown impacted the sports shooting community specifically? Cody just mentioned that you weren't able to renew and other things like that, but how has this impacted the sports shooting community?
Well, we're talking about the shutdown of shooting ranges. I mean, that's kind of been the big impact. The shooting ranges across the state have been shut down, and that's where, sports shooting takes place, is on these formal ranges. In terms of going with, the governor's order and understanding that we do have a responsibility to one another to try and not get one another sick. The largest cowboy action shooting competition in the world actually takes place in New Mexico each spring, and it was canceled this year. But I mean, they typically will have over 1,000 people attend that event. So that makes sense. But at the same time, as like someone like myself or anyone else cannot access a range either to practice, whether it be a new firearm owner who wants to go practice with their firearm to gain proficiency, so they have so they're comfortable using it in a situation. If they want to seek instruction, they can't go to range, and that's one of the real big things. Is a new gun owner cannot go out to a range with a qualified instructor to receive valuable instruction on how to use this firearm properly in order to defend themselves. So, I mean, competitions have been shut down at ranges, but also the instruction mostly takes place at ranges here in New Mexico. But I mean, like I said, military and law enforcement are still able to use the range, but that's not going to help someone when the police in Albuquerque could still be 10 minutes away. You have to be able to defend yourself. You have a right to defend yourself. And the shutdown of ranges has just decimated the instruction that was going on in the state, and it's hurt. We have a number of excellent firearm instructors in New Mexico, and these people have been put out of business as well. And many of them are self-employed. There's only, with the exception of Calibers, who has some in-house training, most of these are sole proprietors who do the instruction. So these are people who, their ability to teach others with their valuable skills, but also, they've been impacted as business owners who are not deemed essential by the state of New Mexico.
Okay. Cody, can you, I'm going to throw in another question. One of the things that we look for in cases for Mountain States Legal Foundation are cases that have the ability to set significant precedent. So while we absolutely want to take care of Zach and the other plaintiffs in this case, we also really want to make sure that that the decision that we receive goes far beyond Zach, that we are impacting the entire state of New Mexico and possibly even more than that. Can you talk about the precedent that we hope to set here?
Absolutely. And just to that point, kind of what you touched on right there at the end is a win here would be a win for the state. If we can, if the court will enter an injunction that stops enforcement, that it's a stay on enforcement statewide. It shouldn't be limited to just the particular individuals in the case. They're representative of the entirety of the state of New Mexico. And all three of the other organizations involved have members across the state that are all impacted by this. And that's why they're involved, not only for their own, the issues that they've experienced, expending resources and trying to stay on top of these issues, but also for their members that are impacted. So that's a really important consideration there. And the key here is to establish that the government cannot unilaterally infringe on your natural rights, your constitutionally protected rights, a right that the Supreme Court deemed fundamental in 2010 and incorporated against the states. While we understand that the government is trying to respond to the COVID-19, that doesn't mean that the government can trample on your natural rights. You have a right to possess arms independent of the government. And it's important that we reiterate that in the courts and that the court acknowledges that for future cases, such as this one, such as ones that are occurring across the country in response to similar issues, but also for the future, for the next lockdown that may or may not occur, but also just for general response. I mean, these rights are removed from the government's power and ability to infringe upon. And it doesn't matter the scenario, you still have that right. And that's the important thing that we must reiterate before the court. And that's something that we need to make sure reverberates across the nation.
Absolutely. We have a follow-along question from Marie, speaking to the urgency of the case and why it's important that we start getting decisions on this soon. So her question is, with 71 deaths in the entire state, how is this situation we find ourselves in an emergency? Is there any way to fast track the lawsuit? We need relief from this restriction as soon as possible.
And yes, that's what we've done. So that's what a preliminary injunction is. That puts the issue before the court more quickly. Now, it's not the quickest possible that we can get there, but it's about as quick as this case will be able to get any sort of authoritative decision from the court. Ordinarily, federal court litigation takes years, and to get a final resolution of the court could take a year, could take 2 years, but a preliminary injunction doesn't take that long. Most likely, we will have the briefing in this case for this injunction, fully forming the arguments before the court, will resolve right at the start of May, right around May 1 or shortly thereafter. And because it's such an important issue, and because the harm here is so imminent and it just compounds every day that this order is able to be enforced and is enforced, we'll likely get a decision out of the court early in May. So that's our hope. That's our goal here, is not to try to wait around to get a final decision on the merits, which obviously we will do, and we'll continue to litigate the case and address the issue, but to get immediate and interim relief from the court as quickly as possible.
And if I can follow up on that, Andrew is asking, can firearm retailers and ranges refuse to open for the exempt class?
Yeah, there's nothing that would require a business to provide, that I'm aware of, that would require a business to provide arms or ammunition to law enforcement in this scenario. As a matter of fact, not necessarily to specifically, not provide them with services, but a lot of firearms retailers have had to just completely close down because they can't afford to operate without civilian traffic, without everyday Americans traffic. So they can't afford to stay open even for law enforcement because they don't have other income coming in. They're not making other sales, and they're not providing other services to the citizens of New Mexico. So kind of on both sides of it, there a lot have had to close just because of that. And no, I don't believe there is any requirement for them to provide services.
Okay. We are short on time, so this will be the last question for our panel. John is asking, it appears the New Mexico law does not specifically ban the sale of firearms, unlike North Carolina's former emergency powers law that was overturned in Bateman v. Purdue, which that might be a local, I'm unfamiliar with the case, but you might be, Cody. Do you want to comment on that one?
Sure. Yeah. So it's slightly different than the Bateman case, which dealt with was an emergency powers case and did specifically prohibit the sale of firearms. New Mexico's does not do that. What it does is it completely prohibits the operation of any business that is not essential. And firearms retailers, manufacturers, ranges, repair facilities, none of those were designated as essential. So it requires them to reduce their business operations by 100%, which is a complete closure. So it does operate a little bit different than the Bateman case, the North Carolina issue, but functionally it's the same. Functionally, what the governor has done has prohibited the sale of firearms because by stopping in-person transfers and by the system that's created by the federal government and by the state of New Mexico, you cannot take possession of a firearm. I mean, I guess you could still technically pay money and purchase one online, but you could never receive that firearm. It wouldn't mean anything. You couldn't use that to defend yourself. You couldn't use that to defend your family or your home. So the effect of the order here is exactly the same, and it completely prohibits that in-person transfer that's necessary to take possession of a firearm.
And Andrew slid one really good question in just under the bar, so I'm going to have to ask this one last one. Is BLM land, which is the Federal Bureau of Land Management, suited for firearm training, still open to the public as an alternative to private gun range facilities?
That is unclear. So because shooting and because training has not been deemed essential, there's an open question, at least under interpretation of the order, of whether or not you can travel to engage in that activity. So travel is otherwise prohibited except for engaging in essential business, or so buying groceries, working if you are an essential employee, traveling to your job. So because training with a firearm hasn't been deemed as essential by the governor, then arguably you might not be able to travel to do so. And that's an important nuance, and something that we made sure to address in the lawsuit, is that you must also allow individuals to travel to use these businesses and to train with their firearms. So that's kind of the important, or the distinction there. I don't know of any specific enforcement against BLM ranges. I don't know if they've specifically closed them down or have tried to cordon them off or anything like that, but that would be the nuance there.
Very good. Well, folks, we have reached the end of our time. We are so grateful you joined us for your lunch hour, for those of you who are here in Mountain Standard Time. And we are so grateful for our panelists, Cody, thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this matter. And Zach, thank you so much for being a courageous client and fighting for not just yourself, but so many others who are there in New Mexico. So we very much appreciate both of your contributions today and in the near future. If you still have questions or would like to reach out to Mountain States about this or any of our other work, please, you can reach us at contact@mslegal.org. That email address again is contact@mslegal.org, and we would love to visit with you. For this afternoon, thank you again for joining us, and have a safe and wonderful weekend.